In this video, I'm going to explain some basics about different types of fabric and what to keep in mind when you buy your fabrics. There are two main types of fabric, woven or knit. Woven fabrics are usually non-stretch fabrics like cotton or viscose or rayon, and these fabrics tend to fray. Knit fabrics are usually stretch fabrics like cotton lycra or cotton spandex or trilobal, and these fabrics usually do not fray because they are made from one continuous thread being looped together. So with a knit fabric, you can get away with leaving the edge raw on the inside and not finishing it off with an overcasting stitch, but it does look more professional if all your seams on the inside are finished properly. I always say it's those small details that makes the difference and makes your project much more professional. Then you also get fabric blends, where the natural fibers are mixed with synthetic fibers. For example, the cotton lycra or cotton spandex are natural cotton fibers combined with synthetic spandex fibers. When you're in the fabric store and you want to test the stretch of the fabric, don't just grab on a section and start pulling. Always fold your fabric on the grain and pull in the direction of the grain. The reason we fold the fabric is that all fabric stretches on the bias, even your woven fabrics that usually doesn't stretch. So if you just go ahead and start pulling, you might actually pull the fabric on the bias and then you think this fabric stretches when it actually doesn't. When you want to test if your fabric stretches in one direction or both, you can just fold your fabric on both grains. The selvage of the fabric is the tightly woven factory edge that runs parallel to the lengthwise grain, and the width of the fabric is measured from selvage to selvage. The two most common widths of fabric are 150 centimeters and then 115 centimeters. Usually a diagram of how to lay out your pattern pieces onto your fabric is included in the pattern instructions, but there are still a few important things that's not always that obvious when it comes to pattern layout and buying the correct amount of fabric. Tip number 1, the fabric nap. So the nap of the fabric is the texture of a fabric with the raised fibers going in a particular direction. So when you cut out your pattern pieces, they should all go in the same direction. An example of this type of fabric is fleece or velvet. If your fabric doesn't have a nap, you can rotate your pattern pieces in any direction as long as it follows the grain of the fabric. Tip number 2, the direction of the print. When your fabric has a print with a definite top and bottom, your pattern pieces should also all go in the same direction. For example, here you can see the flowers all point upwards, so your pattern pieces also should point upwards. If your fabric has a pattern that doesn't have a specific direction, like the polka dots, you can place your pattern pieces in any direction as long as it follows the grain of the fabric. Tip number 3, pattern matching. When you use a printed fabric and you want to match your pattern, it can be quite daunting. But my first advice is to always buy an extra pattern sequence. For example, here you will see the pattern sequence that's repeated for these two fabrics. So at the fabric store, I will ask them to measure the amount of fabric that I need for the pattern as it is specified by the pattern, and then I add an additional sequence onto that. So I'll add one of these sections. For me, the easiest way to match the pattern is to use the sequence as a guide. So let's say I want to make a pair of pants and I want to match it on the sides. Then I will align the top of the sides at the same spot in the pattern sequence. In the second example, you will see that I have a little bit more wastage in order to match my pattern, but it's just because the pattern sequence is much bigger than the first one. Tip number 4, pattern direction. It is very important that you follow the pattern markings to place your patterns in the right direction. Most of the pattern pieces will go with the grain, so this arrow needs to follow the grain line of the fabric. So as I've mentioned before, the selvage runs parallel to the lengthwise grain, and then the opposite grain is called the cross grain. So you can then place your patterns in both directions as long as your fabric doesn't have a nap or a definite printed pattern. Then you can also place your fabric on the fold. This is usually indicated by this arrow. So you fold your fabric selvage to selvage and then align that edge of the pattern onto the fold line. Then you can also get pattern pieces that should be placed on the bias. This allows more flowiness in your garment, for example, a cowl neckline. I hope you learned something new today and got a few tips for the next time you go fabric shopping.